Hangouts. We have these every Thursday night at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. And today, well, that's when we aim for starting. We're actually starting a little bit late. Today, normally Tim Adams is in charge of these things. Well, he couldn't make it today, so I'm taking over the reins. With me is Charles Smith, who's from Texas, and he's waving down below. And so we're going to be talking all about recruiting volunteers, getting more people into your ministry, and sharing the load. So that's kind of an area that I think a lot of churches struggle with. They think, man, it's just too hard, or no one wants to do what I do. And some of these are quite frankly myths. So that's one of the things we're going to deal with. And hopefully, as a result of this Hangout, you and your church will be able to get more people involved in the ministry and be able to just spread the good news. You know, it's called that for a reason, that Jesus wants us to tell others just about this great thing that he's done for us. And as church tech people, quite frankly, I think we have the best job. Now, don't tell the childcare people, don't tell the youth people, don't tell the music people, but I really do think that we have the best job. And that's probably secret number one, is that you really have to fall in love with your ministry. If you think of it as a chore, if you think of it as something that you have to do as opposed to something that you get to do, you're probably going to have a hard time inviting someone else into it. So start with your own attitude. If you're showing up on Sunday or Saturday or Wednesday, whenever you have church, if you're showing up with an attitude like, I wish this was over, and it hasn't even started, that's going to rub off on other people. And I mean, just think about it. If you're looking at it from the outside, and the person trying to recruit you comes up and says, you want to do this thing? It's not fun. I really hate it, but I hate being alone even more. You know, Eeyore is not a great recruiter. So that's secret number one, I think, is make sure that you've fallen in love with your ministry and you're willing to ask people into it because you think that it's a good thing to do. You kind of feel sorry for other people, not in a condescending or bad way, but you just really love the gift that you've been given. So that's the first thing that I've seen. It seems to work. The second thing that I've seen that's very helpful when you're recruiting people is when you're recruiting, not casting a small vision. Let me give you an example. I once worked for a company that did AV, so basically a very similar job to what I did at my church. They were paying me, unlike my church. So you would think that I would like that more, but I liked it less. And one of the key reasons was how I was recruited for it. When I responded to the Craigslist ad, the guy said, oh, it's no big deal. You show up a few minutes beforehand, you set everything up, then you leave, you come back sometime after the meeting is over, and you tear it down. No big deal. He actually said, no big deal. Well, when I started working there, I learned that it was a big deal. So if everything wasn't set up hours in advance, at least as soon as possible, the people that were in charge of these meetings, because this was in a hotel, would freak out. They'd be convinced you weren't going to show up at all. So you had to be not a few minutes early, a few hours early was much better. Also, a lot of the times, even when you had everything set up, the hotel housekeeping would unplug things. So that was also a big deal. So people would show up at their meetings and everything would be set up, but it wouldn't work, even though it was all tested. So a lot of the things that this guy told me were not true at all. He told me this was a really easy job, no big deal, and the truth was it was a hard job because to the people that you were doing the meetings for, it was a huge deal. Some of their jobs were on the line. So, like in contrast, in my church, when I get people onto the video team or the tech team, I try and paint the vision that it's not necessarily easy, but it is rewarding. So I think that that gives them kind of the mindset of the Peace Corps or the Marines. Peace Corps, toughest job you'll ever love. Marines, the few, the proud, the Marines. The idea behind their recruiting is this is not easy. And if you can do it, you're special. And some of the time when people hear that and they join in and then they think, well, this isn't nearly as hard as I thought, they're pleasantly surprised and they start to think, well, maybe better at this than I thought I was going to be. So it has a couple of good benefits there. So I think falling in love with your ministry, making sure you don't soft sell the vision, those are a couple of things that I would start off with. I'd also make sure that you're always recruiting, and this really helps if you're involved in your church. So if you're the kind of person that shows up on the weekend and you show up, you're in the tech booth the entire time, you never talk to anybody else, and the moment the pastor says amen on the benediction or the last note of the last song stops, you tear down and get out of there not talking to anyone, you're going to have a lot harder time recruiting than if you meet people. A few years ago, I was in charge. We had this festival that we would do, and
it's 9 o'clock.
As it turned out, there were all the main tech people were doing other things. So we really couldn't use them for the live video that we were doing for this festival. So I decided that I would fill in my team with just whoever I could and train them and get them up and running as quickly as possible. So that's what I did. And as a result, our team grew by a third, I think, just because I was always recruiting. I knew there was no way I could do this by myself. I needed at least 3 camera people, someone to run the switcher, and a couple other positions. So I was always recruiting. Every time I met someone, it somehow came up in conversation. And remember, I'm in love with my ministry. So it wasn't hard for me to say, hey, you seem like you like technical things. Do you want to be a part of the ministry? Hey, you seem like you have a smartphone. Ever take any video with that smartphone? Hey, I see you're holding a DSLR. That looks like you might know how to use a camera. Would you like to use a video camera? So just looking for all these opportunities seemed to help us in recruiting for people. And not everyone said yes, and it's okay, because I don't want everyone on the team. I want the people that God has designed to be on the team to be on the team. But sometimes you have to ask a lot of people before you find the people that God actually has for you. So that's another thing. Probably the last one that I'd say off the top of my head is, and this is going to sound a little counterintuitive, but don't be greedy. I think that there are enough volunteers. I think that it's probably the case that it doesn't feel like there are, but I think that if God wants you to do something, He'll provide the resources to do it, including people. As it turns out, He's really good at making them, and He knows the future, so He knew to make them 15, 20, 40, 60 years ago. So I don't think that we need to live in scarcity in volunteers. So if you are talking to someone and they're just talking about how children's ministry makes them come alive, but they just haven't quite found a place yet, take them over to the children's minister. If they're talking about how they love music, take them over to the music minister. If they're talking about how much they love youth, take them over to the youth minister, etc. Don't necessarily say, oh, warm body, perfect, because they may not be. So I think that you can't be greedy in this. And if everyone in your church is on the same is doing the same thing like this, the music minister might meet someone that says, yeah, music isn't my thing, but I really like computers. Oh, really? Let me take you over to the technical team lead, which might just mean the only person that does it right now. But if you're all working together as a team, I think that that can really help out. So those are a few of the things that I've been thinking about this, just in light of the challenges that we all encounter. So Charles, who's joining me, says that he's got some stuff that he'd like to add on. And so Charles, why don't you go right ahead and tell us what those are?
Well, everything you said is right on point. I just might expound on a couple of things here. The casting of vision. I mean, casting a vision can sometimes be a lot like a lot of things. There's a ditch you can fall into with your vision on each side. Like in the case of your experience where you were recruited to do AV work for a company that did that work at the hotel. That vision was cast, should I say, too shallow. And those of us that work in the tech field have a challenge to not do something like that. Because to us, I mean, you got to look at it from the perspective of those of us that do it day in and day out. When you go to recruit somebody, you say, oh, this is nothing. This is easy. Come on, help me out. But in reality, yeah, it's nothing because you do it every day. So when you're recruiting people, you got to kind of gauge where the people are coming from. Like the example you were given earlier, if it's somebody that's a heavy smartphone user, they might have a quick learning curve, and you can kind of recruit them in that fashion in the sense of saying that it's easy. But if you've got somebody that's interested, but they've never touched a computer ever, then you kind of have to really break it down for them and say, yeah, this is fun to do, but it takes a little while to get used to running things. But once you run it, you'll love it, and it becomes easy. So you just have to take people where they're at when you're recruiting them, and meeting them where they're at when you're casting that vision, because it's very easy to fall in either ditch. Then the other thing that I kind of keyed off of on the point you were making was about being greedy. What you're talking about being greedy, unless I misunderstood it, was just grabbing anybody you could get. Well, I look at greediness from a different perspective of you do it every day and you can't let go to let somebody else operate it. So when you're training somebody, you got to realize, hey, let go a little bit, let them make mistakes. Yeah, people may whip their heads around and look at you because the mics aren't working right every once in a while because that new person's learning, and you just got to kind of, pardon the term, suck it up and live with it. But there's ways to manage that too. You know, if you're in a larger church and you've got several services or a midweek service that's low attendance, you know, that's the perfect time to train people, is in low attendance periods. You know, you don't want to, you know, train somebody when you've got a major recording artist coming in to do a concert. That's not the time to train somebody. That's the time to have your A team on board. So just some things to keep in mind about the greediness aspect is learn when to let go, learn when to let the people you're recruiting make mistakes, and be willing to, you know, take the heat when some people might complain because it's less than perfect. But you just have to talk to those people and say, hey, we got to get new people on board. So there's going to be a few bumps on the road till we get them there. So just a couple of things that popped into my mind with the points you were making.
Yeah, you made some great points there, Charles. First off, I think that if you were involved in your church's tech ministry, your goal should be not to be the only one that knows anything. And a lot of times in churches, it's easy to be the only one who knows how to do stuff, but it's really for your own good if you have someone who at least knows how to do it, even if they don't regularly do it. Because you can imagine you get called into work once in a lifetime thing, some big problem had happened at work, and you have to be there when you're normally at church. And you find this out an hour before church. If you're the only one that knows how to do it, church has just been jeopardized depending on the level of tech involvement in your church. But if you have at least someone who knows how to do it, even if they don't regularly do it, that's really good. That's really helpful that you can get this taken care of. So there's that. I think just in general, if you view what you're doing as a blessing, you might tend towards greed in doing it over and over again and thinking, yes, this is my ministry, I get to do it, and no one else does. And you don't want to do that. You want to bless someone else by letting them come alongside you. I mean, the Apostle Paul was apparently a pretty good preacher. He was pretty good at writing, but he always seemed to have someone with him. He always had Barnabas or Timothy or John Mark, although that didn't work out too well. Things like that, where there was always someone involved in the ministry with him. And I think that that's something else. You can also be protective of people that you don't need to be protective of. Like, in my church, we call it saying someone's no for them. Like, you look at someone and you go, oh, well, clearly they're too busy, so I won't bother to ask them. Well, you don't know that they're too busy. You just assume they're too busy. And it could be they're looking for an excuse to ditch something that they really don't like for something that they can say really matters a lot more. So maybe the mother of 6 kids really needs a weeknight off for practice. Just really needs a good excuse to tell her husband, hey, you take the kids and I'm serving at church, which sounds like a much better excuse than you take the kids and I just want to go out with the girls. Maybe she would feel guilty about going out with the girls, but serving Jesus, she's not feeling guilty at all about. That sounds great. So maybe the excuse that you see is actually something they're trying to get out of. One thing you talked about training other people that I think is really a great idea as well is the process of training people. When you get someone new, you might be tempted just to throw them in the deep end and say, yay, I get a weekend off, have fun, and you don't train them at all, and that's no good. On the other end of the spectrum, you might be tempted to train them and never let them take over, and they can get disheartened on that end, like, he just doesn't think that I'm ever going to be good enough for this, and that's no good either. So, like you say, there's 2 ditches you can fall into, and you want to avoid both of those. When I'm training someone, I think of it as a 4-step process, and each of these steps could take anywhere from minutes to days, weeks, months, or years. So the first step is someone watches me do it, then they help me do it, then I help them do it, and they do it. So, let's take running a video camera. Someone watches me run a video camera. Then they help me run a video camera. Occasionally I let them Zoom, or I let them pan during a practice or something like that, then they do it and I help them. So then they've got the lion's share, but I'm still there as their backup. So if anything happens, I can jump in, and that provides a little security for them. And then finally, they take over and I'm just around. I might not even be paying all that much attention, just there for catastrophic failure. So I think that that's a great way once you get some people involved. Charles, you had something else?
Yeah, I mean, those stages work really well. I mean, I've got a few people that I've tried to train to be my replacements, but for the most part, week in, week out, I'm it in my church, which is typically the case in a small church, less than 100 members. You got one person and no backup. And I don't even like being in that position because guess what? If I want to get away for one weekend, it's very tough. And that's where it does become kind of a chore. But I'm digressing there. The nice thing, though, about training new people through all four of those stages is it can point out some things as long as you're being humble and you don't take it as a pride hit. It can point some flaws out in your workflow that you may need to work out. Case in point, I was gone a couple of weeks ago, had to go visit the grandparents, had somebody filling in for me that really hadn't watched me much, so they kind of got thrown into the fire. But the good thing is a good chunk of what I do, I have wrote in, a little book per se, and it's not handwritten. It's a Word document that I've printed out with pictures and screenshots, illustrations, because I learn visually, so hopefully that helps other people out. Everything seemed to work okay when I was gone, except for there was one song that, well, let me tell a story and then get back to this. My wife was, of course, also gone with me, and she was the pianist. So we had no live music for church either, with her being gone with me. Now, most of the songs that we sing on a regular basis, we've actually taken a keyboard, hooked it up to a computer, and recorded them as MP3s, and we've got, I'd say, probably 80% of our hymnal recorded between her and her brother, because when her brother was home once, we did that. But there's certain songs that you sometimes play during your service that aren't necessarily in the hymnal. And we recently changed the order of our worship service in the last year and a half, 2 years. And we now sing a different song in a particular part of the worship service. But I really hadn't been gone in a year and a half, 2 years where that song was actually needed. So during the service, they were missing that song. So the guy that covered for me pointed it out to me. So there's something that we got to fix. So like I say, as long as you've got a humble spirit and you don't take it as a pride hit, training volunteers and working them through your workflow, can help you improve the process. It might mean recording a song. It might mean updating the book you have, or relabeling a piece of equipment or a slider on the mixer board that's not labeled right, things like that. So training isn't just about helping bring other people up to your level. It actually helps you in making sure your stuff's better documented.
Yeah, I think you made a great point there. In my church, we call them procedures. And I've got to tell you, probably the thing that I hate most in life, and I'm the author of 5 books, keep in mind, 5. The thing I hate most in life is writing down procedures, because I love telling stories, and a procedure is more, okay, now click on file, now go down to save, click on that. Very boring, very dry. You might have screen captures, things like that. But it's really nice to have those. And it's really nice to have them before you go out of town, as opposed to scrambling while you're trying to pack, or while you should be doing other things to try and get them up to speed. So I think that that's probably another good point with training volunteers once you have them, is if you've already done the work, to have something, whether it's a written procedure, or a how-to manual, or even screencasts. When I started doing my ProPresenter screencast, the motivation was so that our satellite campus, anytime they had a question about using ProPresenter, they didn't have to ask me. They could just go to my channel, watch the appropriate video, and then go, oh, that's how you do that. And it just took off from there. So I think that that's another valuable thing, is just have everything ready to go so that training is easier, so that every time you get someone new, it's not, okay, now what all do they need to know? And when you get deep into the training, you realize, oh, I forgot to tell them to do this one really important thing because I just do it without thinking about it. You've already got your list. You're already checking it twice, finding which thing is good and which isn't, you know. So I think that that's a really good thing as well, to have everything in place so that training is as easy as possible. I think, too, another thing is recognizing everyone is not going to work out, even if they look like they're the perfect candidate for the tech ministry. It could be that they try it out and there's more stress there than they thought, or they thought they were an even-keeled person, but as it turns out, they get madder than they should when someone points out a growth area, things like that. Not everyone is perfect for this, and so I think you really always need to be recruiting, even if it feels like, oh, we got plenty of people on the team. If you ever hit that point, that's probably the best time to be recruiting, because it's better to have spare people for when the person goes, you know, I'm a little burnt out. No problem. We got someone to step in. We've got a deep bench, as they say in sports. So that's, I think that's a great idea as well. Charles, do you have a story about someone that wasn't quite right for your tech ministry?
Not directly. I mean, it's just things that I've seen because I work in the computer field. So I'm going to kind of equate the computer field here to the tech ministry for a split second. But
Right.
Anyways, sorry, I had a distraction behind me. um, in the computer field, if you're doing work on computers and somebody comes to you all the time and they're constantly getting spyware on their machine, constantly, and you kind of give them advice as to how to avoid that spyware, how not to get it, and they still end up with it on it, then you start saying that maybe that person's not good for, say, a PC, but maybe they should get a Mac, those sort of things. Well, in the tech industry, it's the same way. If you bring somebody into your church tech stuff and they come in and the week after they leave, all the gain and the sliders and the balance and the adjustment and the settings are all different after they leave, and you kind of tell them, hey, I've got this tuned a certain way, not that you're trying to be a control freak about it, but you've got it a certain way, but this person feels like the time to experiment with the settings is during a live service and then not revert it back to the way it was before it comes back. If somebody habitually does that and you gently try to change them from that and they don't change, then maybe it's not for them, because there are certain people out there, and I don't mean to sound derogatory in any way, but they're risk takers. If somebody dared them to jump off a cliff, they'll go do it. And when you're doing this kind of work, you need somebody that's reliable and does things in a meticulous way and not so much of an experimental way. At least that's been my experience. Paul, what about you? I mean, has it been a little different than that?
Well, I think that there's a place where experimentation fits in, but while I think you can err a little on the side of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and so in 100 years your church is still doing things the way they did it in 2015. You can err on that side, but you can also err on the side of, well, let's see here. I know that they said to plug the XLR in with the male end going into the board and the female end going into the microphone, but let's reverse it somehow. Yeah, that's not going to work. It just doesn't work that way. So I think that you can err on either side where, no, don't do it that way, and you freak out and chide them for doing things the wrong way, or they actually go crazy and they're experimenting on things that will never work. There are laws of physics preventing what they're trying to make happen. Yes, I'm just trying to send two distinct audio signals down a single mono cable at the same time. Why doesn't that work? Well, there's a law of physics, you see, that it's not that it's not that they're different and you can split them out. It's the same thing, you know. So you can imagine that there are people that will try and experiment in ways they really shouldn't. I think you, Charles, you were talking about one of the churches in your little church group where there is someone who tweaks a lot on their computer, and they tweak it in ways, it's not that they improve the performance or they try it, it doesn't work, and they go back to the way that it is. It's they try it, it doesn't work, and they leave it the broken way. And I think that that's definitely something you want to avoid, making it in a way where they just end up breaking things and not unbreaking them. Maybe that's another good point. That's something to look for, is someone that may be able to experiment in appropriate times, but put it back the way they found it should it not work. You know, and be willing to say, well, it looks like this really works. Why don't we do it this way? Someone who is willing to say, oh, well, that's why we don't do it that way. Oh, okay, we'll go back to your way. You know, because occasionally you'll have someone that says, well, this makes perfect sense that we would do this new way, and you go, well, actually it doesn't work that way. We've tried it. This is why it doesn't work. Let's revert back to the other way. And I think that that's humility on both sides. Humility of saying the new cool way may or may not work, and the old way may or may not be the best. And we just need to know what's the best, because none of us invented electricity, you know. No one in your church invented the sound mixing board or the video camera. And even if they did, they probably, the people that did those things didn't envision everything that they do. So I don't think there's anyone that's so much a genius that they are always right when it comes to this stuff. So anything else along those lines before we move on to something else?
No, I think that's it. That's the thing. It's just like I was kind of getting to there, but I might have been stumbling around. Is finding that balance of somebody that is willing to experiment, but like you say, is willing to return it to the way it was, or become skilled enough that they can. So yeah, and I've got to struggle with that in some place, and part of the responsibility falls on me as well on that, because I've had a couple opportunities where that has happened, and guess what? That has pointed flaws in the workflow where I had to go back and update my documentation and my procedures, and it corrected some of it. But when you have people that also constantly experiment, it's like, how far do you take your procedures? You can make them a 10-page short guide, but if somebody's constantly experimenting, it could be like this. So I'm still struggling with that balance myself.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to training, and I don't want us to talk about training too much because the idea behind the Hangout was all about recruiting, but when it comes to training, I think there are some people that just want to know, okay, you turn this knob to 3 o'clock, and that's all they want to know. I'm not one of those people. I want to know why turning it to 3 o'clock gives us the result that we're looking for. Why does that? So that if there's a problem, I know, okay, this person is not as loud as the other people, so I might need to turn that knob, which is the gain on the soundboard in this example, I might need to turn it to 4 o'clock. And that might give me just a little bit more. And that's all I need to know. Whereas the first person goes, well, it's on 3 o'clock like it always is. I don't know why it's not working. So I think there's room for both kinds of people in the ministry, but I think that ideally the person would know why when you do this, it gets you this. So that if something changes, they know, well, the output is different, so therefore I need to change the input somehow. And this is the way that I do that. So that's a distinct difference in how you train someone. And I think that that's when someone crosses over from being just an operator to someone that's able to deal with consequences better. They're able to deal with unusual situations better. And ideally, that's what you want. But sometimes you just need someone who knows music enough to hit the space bar at the right time. A trained monkey could probably do this, but you need someone to do this. And other times you need someone that when the computer doesn't work, they know how to fix it. And everyone doesn't have to be either kind, but it's nice to have both, you know. Sometimes just the spacebar tapper kind of volunteer is all you need.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, that's kind of the way I am at the church I'm at. When our pastor's there, since he's very free to move around, should I say, it takes 3 people to operate our system. Since he moves around a lot, we need a camera person, a person to put slides on the screen, and a person to manage the switcher, if you will, for the live stream going back and forth between camera and slides. And honestly, that person that currently is running the switcher to switch between the camera and the slides is that person you're talking about. They're the ones that all they have to do is essentially, it's not the space bar, but it's essentially that simple. Press one key when I tell them go. And the only reason I have them there is because the computer's out of reach. Sometimes that's all you need. But that's also the person that I'm starting out with. That's their first level of training. You know, then they're going to graduate to probably operating the camera. And then probably after operating camera, then they'll graduate to put slides on the screen. So, you know, there's certain progressions you can do when you're training people from one piece of equipment to the other. Certain things are easier to learn first. And that's also helps with your recruiting. To kind of segue back to recruiting is, you know, try to recruit those people for those entry level positions. And if you've already got somebody serving in that entry level position, move them on up like the Jeffersons. So anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That it's certainly the case that some people will come in and they're ready for the top level position. Like, let's say you have someone that works at a local ball field, or someone that works in a local hotel setting up AV stuff. They need a little bit of training to know the specifics of your specific system, which is probably totally different than what they're used to, but they can cut and paste principles. There's someone else that may be technical, and one thing that sometimes pastors don't understand is that there's a wide variety of technical disciplines, and just because I understand video doesn't mean that I know IT. And just because someone else knows IT doesn't mean that they can understand sound. So technical in general doesn't necessarily mean you're the perfect technician for this specific ministry. But I think that sometimes those people are more easy to train because they just look at things in a similar way. But I don't think, I think you're absolutely right. There are entry level positions that you can probably recruit people for that you haven't even thought of. Like, I think about teenagers as perhaps a good untapped market. The children's ministry at our church is really good at getting teenage girls involved. It's not a hard sell for a lot of them. I'm sure there are some that it's a hard sell for, but for a lot of them, it's not. But what about the teenage boy that would rather uh, do computer programming? Is the children's ministry the right place for him? Or is perhaps the technical ministry a better place for him? And just because he's young, that doesn't mean that it's not right for him. And I'm overgeneralizing, of course. Teenage girls might be just as good, if not better, than the teenage boys you have. It changes from individual to individual. But I was talking to, back maybe 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I was at a church and they had Leonard Sweet in, who is just a great deep thinker in the church. And I asked him this question, you know, where do I find volunteers? Because I was struggling at the time. And he told me this story, how that in the 21st century, we think of artists as lonely, solitary people. But in the Renaissance, that's not the way that it was. Just because an artist's name was on a painting doesn't mean that that artist was the only person who touched that canvas from the time it came from the store until it was a masterpiece. In fact, that's probably not the case. That a lot of times there are things that the master might not have touched much at all, that were from the school of Leonardo da Vinci or the school of Michelangelo. And if you think of your tech ministry kind of in that same way, that you have the opportunity to bring people into your school of tech ministry, where you can develop future technical artists. And maybe at first, all they can do is hit the space bar at the next to last syllable of the song. And they can't tell whether it's a slow song or a fast song. If the music minister skips a verse, they're lost. Maybe they're not there yet, but it could be in 10 years. They're a genius. They just need more and more experience. So I think that that's sometimes a good place to find people, is younger people than maybe you've considered. But another thing that I see is older people than a lot of people consider as well. If you think about when the Macintosh was introduced, 1984. So it's 2015. That is 31 years ago. If someone was 30 or 40 years old, I'm 41. Let's say someone was 41 years old when the Macintosh was introduced, loved it, bought one immediately, was into it. Now, 31 years later, they are 72 years old. All of a sudden, 72 doesn't seem like, oh, this is someone that's afraid of computers, when you know people that are in their early 40s that are really into technology. There's no reason why someone wasn't really into technology in their early 40s 30 years ago. I mean, so there's another area that maybe you have dismissed older people as people that could be involved in technology. Granted, some should they're not into it at all. They're convinced that they're going to break the internet if they get near a computer, whether it's connected online or not. That might not be the right person, but there could be someone that was programming with punch cards and in assembly language back in the 70s, and they've just kept up on their skills, and it's nothing for them to just hop right onto your computer to run ProPresenter or Media Shout or whatever worship software you have. So anything along that line spark something for you, Charles?
Well, as far as not, counting out the older generation, I mean, the biggest thing that I've seen is somebody that's had I would say, an engineering type background, whether traditionally educated or through School of Hard Knocks. If they've done something engineering related, they tend to have the thought processes and the mindset to pick things up that are new and forthcoming with technology. So, if you've got any old, mechanical engineers or electrical engineers or maybe even just electricians in the church, and they seem to have a smartphone they carry around with them and they're 60 years old, they might pick up, the church tech stuff really well. You ought to give them a shot. They may or may not work, but sometimes those people have a thirst for knowledge because they love engineering things. So just something to keep in mind.
And you never know where it's going to lead either. It's certainly the case that you might pick someone to run a computer and find out, oh, in her spare time, she shoots with the camera a lot, stills of family and friends, and turning that into a camera operator or even someone who operates a switcher may be really easy. So you never know where that's going to lead. Or if you're tapping an engineer on the shoulder, it could be that you've been struggling with the problem, and with their analytical mind, they can go, well, why don't you do it this way? And when they say that, you suddenly feel stupid because you think it is so obvious now that someone else pointed it out. Why didn't I have this person on my team 5 years ago? Oh yes, I counted them out because they're retired. So I think it's absolutely the case that there's plenty of people out there that you just need to experiment, really, because you don't know who your next best volunteer is going to be. It could be the little old lady that you think there's no way she'll be helpful, or it could be the teenager that right now you can't get them off their smartphone when they're supposed to be singing a song of praise and worship to the Lord, but it turns out they're a little ADD and they get distracted by things. But if you give them a task, they zoom in on it, and they're actually kind of hard to get off of it to do something else. So it could be that you're helping someone fill spare clock cycles in their brain, to use a metaphor, and you're helping them enter into worship in a way that they weren't able to do before. I think maybe that points out another thing is sometimes people hesitate to recruit people because they think that they're stealing them away from worship. And while it's the case that it's different, I don't think that it's necessarily the case that if God made you to do technology in the church, that you're not going to get anything out of it, that you're going to be in this spiritual limbo where you're not able to grow at all. I think that sometimes by serving, you do grow in ways that you just, maybe you were stuck in a certain place, and by serving, it frees you up. I think that more than once in my experience, I've just found that in serving, I worship differently. than I do when I'm in the congregation just singing. There, maybe it's because I feel like I'm a part of the team and I'm making it happen, or maybe it's because I'm made for it. I don't know what it is, but I think that that's something that's certainly the case, that there are certain people that you're actually helping them get closer to the Lord by giving them an opportunity to volunteer. So, in fact, it's just the opposite from what you might be afraid of. Um, it might be the case that you're thinking, oh, I don't want to take worship away from someone, whereas what you're doing is you're empowering them to be a part of changing lives and eternities in a way that they never dreamed that they could be. So I think that it's a good way to overcome selfishness. And Charles, you had a great point here in the chat about selfishness. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, it was just an interesting quote I heard this weekend, and I may have it not totally correct, but the quote was, "What's the cure for selfishness?" And a lot of times that is doing something else for someone else gets you to think outside of yourself, because that can sometimes be the biggest struggle in recruiting volunteers. You go to somebody, and it's not that you want to take them from the worship service, like you were saying. They don't want to leave the worship service. Well, it's a job. It's work. I don't want to leave. I'm enjoying the worship service. Da 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 da. So the more that you can say without being insulting, and I can't come up with the words right now myself off the cuff, but somehow spinning around on them when they start saying, "Well, you're going to take me away from the worship service." Da 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 da. You got to be the cheerleader to say that, hey, if you're serving others, you're going to be less selfish. But of course, when I say that just raw like that, it's kind of a
Right.
barb. So you have to use some creative wordings to kind of get them to think beyond themselves.
Yeah, I think that there's a certain level of spiritual maturity that goes with moving from being someone that sits in the pew or the padded chair, depending on your church, but there's a certain level of spiritual maturity that you gain when you move into serving, that it can really get you past yourself in a way that not a lot of other things do. I mean, I've been what I call a marathon volunteer for years. I think, Charles, you're in this situation where most of the time you're the only one. For years, I've been the only one, even in a larger church, to do very specific roles where I was on most weeks. Right now, I'm in a season where I'm on 2 to 3 weeks a month, which feels like luxurious time off. Like this upcoming weekend, I'm not serving in church, and I'm like, wow, what am I going to do with myself? This is crazy. I don't have to show up 3 hours before church starts to make sure everything's working. I don't, is it a sin that I'm going to sleep in and show up at the 9 o'clock service? No, but it's just a totally different way of viewing it. And I don't, all the other weeks, I don't think, oh no, I have to get up. I have to show up at church. I hate this. I think, oh, this is Sunday. This is what I do. And then kind of these occasional weeks that I'm off, I'm confused about what to do. And it's not that I derive my identity from it necessarily, but that I just really feel like I'm really helping God advance the ball down the field. He doesn't need me. He can do it himself. But like a good father, which God is a great father, he has invited me in to help him, even though he can do it all himself. And it's just delightful to see that my little bit of help really does do stuff. And it's because God's doing most of the work in the background, but still, he lets me help. I mean, Father Charles, you've probably seen this before, where you invite your kids to help and you're actually doing most of the work, but you've just allowed them to be involved and they're delighted by it. Even though really you could do it yourself and you could probably do it better and faster yourself, but by pulling them in, it's a moment of connection with your children. I think that God is like that. I think that's why he wants us to serve, because he wants to give us the opportunity to have the delight of service. And that's what, when you don't recruit, when you don't bring people into the game, when you don't get them on your team, you're denying them the opportunity and delight of, wait, I made that video and someone came to know Jesus as a result. That happened to me 15 years ago. And I'm still getting choked up about it. What if no one had invited me into it? My life would be totally different. Maybe I wouldn't be, I'm not an expert in selflessness, but maybe I'd be horrible at it as opposed to just average. So I think that it's really, when you think about recruiting, you're really helping people in a way that they may not even know that they're being helped. I think, Charles, you were going to say something earlier before I almost burst into tears.
Yeah. Well, you keyed on a point there about, being a dad and stuff like that. When you're recruiting people, I mean, this is going to sound kind of goofy, but think of you as the daddy in the relationship of the person you're recruiting. Sometimes teaching someone something and watching those gears turn in their eyes as they grasp a concept and learn it can be a big blessing. I mean, when you started talking about my kids, I mean, I thought of a great example from just this last weekend. Usually right after church, I come home and I start editing videos. I isolate myself from the world. Well, of course, my 4-year-old wanted to hang out in the office with me. So I was like, well, what do I do with him instead of turning him away like I would normally do in a situation like that? So I brought him in, let him sit on my lap. And as I was editing the videos, I was basically, my video editing is pretty simple. I put a start point at the beginning of the video, an end point with some fades on each end. And that's it. That's really the only video editing I do. So as I found my start and end points, I was like, right when I'd find it, I'm like, what's that number? Because he's really getting good with his numbers. What's that number? And he'd get it, memorize it, and then when I'd get ready to actually come back to it and make the cut, I'm like, what's that number? And get him to repeat that number for me. And just to see him grasp that concept in his eyes was kind of like, wow. So I know that's talking to a child, but same thing when you're recruiting volunteers. You can see that in the eyes of your volunteers when they grasp something, and it's just like, wow. So when you start getting stuck in a rut, thinking I'm doing this every week, nobody helps me, nobody wants to help me. When you finally get that one person that wants to help you and you see that they grasp it, you're like, yes. Anyway.
Yeah, I think sometimes getting your first volunteer to help you is the hardest part. Once you have one, getting a second becomes a lot easier. And once you have two, getting a third becomes even easier. And I don't know if part of it is when you're by yourself, it's a little desperation. And it's kind of like when you're too needy and you go on a date with someone and, they just, that turns them off more than anything. But it seems like if you've got a girlfriend or if you're talking to someone then all of a sudden there are other people involved that are interested in you. And I think maybe there's a little bit of that with volunteering, that if you're the only person, if you're the Lone Ranger, the moment you have Tonto on board, it becomes easier to get someone else to help you than when you're just going it alone. At least it seemed like that the last time that I really led the team. I was at one of our satellite campuses, and for probably 18 months, I was the only one, and we got another person, one. And then 2 months later, we got another person, and the first person stuck. So that was really great. And we got a third person, and this satellite campus was 45 minutes from my house. So I was helping out because I love the church, not because I love the drive. So before long, we had 5 or 6 people that could do my job. And when you have 5 or 6 people that can do your job, I knew there was something else for me to do. I just wasn't free to do it. So as soon as I was free to do it, I came back to our main campus, and well, I told you earlier, I've been on, 3 out of 4 weeks. So they needed me, but I was doing something else. So sometimes it might be the case that when you recruit someone, it's not that you will be unnecessary. It's that there are things right now that you would like to do, but you can't, that then you can. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that if you get, I don't know, a dozen new people in the next year, it could happen. If Charles, if you got a dozen new people in the next year, you could probably have, you say it takes 3, they could be on once a month, and then you could handle the role of putting out the fires that will happen because you know that they do. And instead of going, okay, we're not doing lyrics right now while I make sure that there's sound, they can keep doing what they're doing, and then you find, oh, there's a flip circuit breaker at the amp, no problem. But you don't have the stress of trying to do 2 jobs at once. So that's great, you know? So I think that that's another valuable thing about recruiting volunteers, is getting more people on board frees you up to do more that maybe you've been putting on the side because it wasn't as urgent, but it still is important. So I think that's worth doing. We're running a little low on time. I think probably here in the next 5 minutes we'll tie it up. But are there any other thoughts you had, Charles, about
Well,
all this?
just something for other people to think out there. Like say in your tech ministry, you've got sound down, you got putting slides up on a screen down, but you'd like to start live streaming. But what's stopping you is you realize that's going to now become a 3-man show, like we were talking about earlier. That would behoove you to recruit volunteers, for those other roles, like say sound and slides. Because if you think you can be the one to be the experimental one, if you will, to experiment with live streaming, having somebody start backfilling those other roles would free you up to get into the live streaming role. So that's something to think about when you're recruiting volunteers, as well as, don't shortchange people because you're bringing them in for what you would consider to be menial or small tasks, but getting them in for those menial or small tasks would actually be able to help free you up if you want to take the ministry to the next level. That allows that to happen.
Right. Exactly. And so that's, I think that matters as well, because there are probably areas of the tech ministry that you're either not very good at, or that you view them as necessary evils. And it's easy to believe that everyone sees it that way, But there are people, believe it or not, that see things that you do as, oh, I wish I didn't have to do this part of it. And they're like, oh, I'll totally take that. And so sometimes getting a volunteer for your tech ministry might be getting someone that is really good at organization and administration to handle the scheduling. And maybe they're not technical per se, but they're great with making phone calls, or they're great with sending out text messages. In our tech ministry, we've got a girl like that. She's, I think she's about 30 years old, and her name is Joanna. And Joanna is a whiz. Now, she has run slides on occasion, but if you want to see her come alive, you give her a list of names and say, can you just make sure that they know when they're on this next month? She'll do that without thinking about it. It would drive me crazy. I would just put it off and then eventually get to it. And like people would be getting text messages the night before they should be at church the next morning, and maybe they're out of town. It's horrible. But you give that to Joanna and she's on it. She's great at it. She's just incredible. And I think that every area of the tech ministry is like that. So if you're not administrative, look for someone who is. If sound isn't your thing, look for someone who that is their thing. If lighting isn't your thing, maybe you can do all these things, but maybe there's someone that they don't even know how great they are at it. I'm thinking of, there was a girl about 10 years ago that was awesome at lighting at our church. Her name was Alexis, and she got into it because she was a dancer. So as a dancer, she had a feeling for the art and the rhythm of the music, and then she would program the lights to go with the rhythm, and oh, it was just great. Is it bad that I kind of wish she hadn't gotten married and moved with her husband to a different ministry, because she was just so great at it? I mean, I wish her well, but it was just one of those moments where you see someone that's so incredible at it. And she would have never known that if someone hadn't said, hey, you want to learn lights? And she did, and it worked well. So it's the top of the hour. I've just heard the notification from my Mac telling me that. And so I think that we're going to tie it up for the night. Unless you have anything else to add, Charles? Anything at all?
No closing comments. I think you wrapped it up good. So I think it's about time to hang it up. And I believe Tim's going to be back on board to host this next week, but we'll find out, I guess.
Yeah, I think he will. So tune in next week, and we'll be back to normal with the Church Tech Hangout, which is, as I say, most Thursdays starting around 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. And you can find that on the Church Tech group on Google+, or I'm going to get some of these wrong because I'm not involved with them, but Adventist Church Tech, and it seems like there's another one. Ugh. But anyway, if you're a part of one of those groups, or you're just interested and you found this on YouTube, perfectly okay as well. Just join us, and we can hash out more issues. Maybe they're more technical, maybe they're more philosophical, maybe they're more leadership oriented like this one. And until next time, I'm Paul Allen Clifford, and that's been Charles Smith. This week, go out and change lives and eternities. I bet God will let you if you ask. Okay, bye.